want to welcome back Dr. Seemee Ali, who, well, we missed you so much here. And we're planning our way of keeping you here. Dr. Ali was associated with the Dallas Institute for many years, and she received her Ph.D. degree from the Institute of Philosophic Studies at the University of Dallas, where she did her dissertation work under the guidance of our dear Dr. Louise Cowan. Dr. Ali is a fellow of the Dallas Institute. She now teaches at Carthage College in Wisconsin in the Great Ideas program and in the English department. She's published in myth and in literature. In myth, one of the interesting papers is on Okeanos. So David Miller is going to, this afternoon, be speaking of Okeanos. But also Hera, but in literature and on the poet Wallace Stevens and William Faulkner. And she is also has been a fellow of the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. And again, this will be a kind of resonance of this question that Glenn has raised, because Seemee is going to speak to us concerning Hera, and Hera in terms of interiority. Welcome.
Before I launch into my remarks, I would like to pause to express my gratitude to the three founders of this institute who are here today, and to the three who are departed, but whose presence I feel very deeply with us. I know of no other place like the Dallas Institute in the world. A place founded by people who were and still continue to be in love with each other's ideas. So thank you, visionaries, for creating this home for the best of all talking. And thank you, Larry Allams, for keeping its hearth fires burning and for inviting me formally to join this fellowship. Thank you. Hera is the most difficult of all the Olympians to understand, as my teacher, Louise Cowan, writes in her essay on this goddess. Partly, this difficulty emerges because Hera is a figure of extreme paradox, as I hope to show. But that is not all. Hera is also difficult because she makes unwelcome demands upon us. She calls us to rise above our own natures. She wants us to be more than we naturally are. So it can feel entirely natural to resent Hera and her power over us. So James Hillman, in his essay on Hera, recognizes this difficult goddess primarily in her role as the guardian of marriage. This is no small thing, since marriage, as Hillman writes, involves two psychic worlds: the world of huge ideals, as well as the world of mundane practicalities. This coincidentia oppositorum, as Hillman writes, as Hillman observes, is essential to the work of alchemy. He quotes the author of an early alchemical dictionary, who notices, quote, that there's no term in more frequent use among the philosophers, those would be the alchemists, than the word marriage. Sun and moon, mother and son, bride and bridegroom, I'm quoting now from the essay, brother and sister, all these alchemical expressions have references exclusively to the joining of the fixed and the volatile. So marriage becomes archetypal, Hillman concludes, beyond just you and me and our personal lives and our marriage problem. Our marriage problem becomes a place of enormous unhappiness. The last part of this quotation, to me, seems completely unmotivated by anything coming before it. Hillman begins with an uplifting emphasis on marvelous unions between fantastic opposites, heaven and earth, sun and moon, male and female, But his thinking about marriage doesn't end there, where the early alchemical philosopher might have stopped. You surely heard that final pregnant phrase when Hillman mentions our marriage problem. That phrase, marriage problem, recurs several times in the Hera essay, and alas, we all know too well what the problem is. Marriage is an uncomfortable proposition, since it is not, strictly speaking, a natural state of being. Our native discomfort with marriage itself goes some length toward explaining what I take to be an analogous discomfort with the goddess Hera, who, let's admit, is nobody's favorite goddess. It is so terribly easy to think of her as a shrew, as a jealous wife, diminished terribly by her powerful husband's serial infidelities. The venerable scholar of ancient Greek religion, Walter Burkert, has written, wherever we learn any details about Hera festivals, we discover that it is never simply a joyful wedding feast, but a deep crisis in which the established order breaks down and the goddess herself threatens to disappear. Burkert's scholarly opinion affirms the way so many of us might casually imagine Hera as an angry and jealous feminine force, a disturbing presence. And yet at the same time, we know just as well that Hera exerts formidable power in the ancient pantheon. In Burkert's assertion about the cult worship of Hera, the threat of the goddess's disappearance is linked to the threat of chaos, the breakdown of established order. This anxiety reminds us that Hera, cosmic queen, is deeply necessary for order, the Greek word for which is cosmos, a word which also means beauty. Perhaps no other figure among the Greek gods encompasses the dualities of majesty in her role as queen and humiliation in her role as wife, as fully and as constantly as Hera. This duality is only one of many that Hera manifests. These oppositions in her mythic character make her difficult indeed to understand. To give just one example, there's a scene early in the Iliad where she appears on the battlefield, and she is likened to a trembling dove. But almost instantly, she transforms herself into a bronze-voiced warrior named Stentor, whose cry has the force of 50 men's. This is the one and only mention of Stentor in the entire of the long, long epic. But even today, people who have never read the Iliad know what a stentorian voice is when they hear one. It is Hera's powerful voice emanating from a powerful man's body. So this goddess, Hera, who appears as both a shivering dove and a fearsome warrior, a goddess who speaks through the powerful, is a figure of contradiction or tension. To see her clearly is necessarily a problem for us. And among us, I also include generations of classical philologists. Our marriage problem, as Hillman calls it, may also be our unease with Hera's tendency to yoke two heterogeneous elements together and then to imagine them as one. The verb to imagine is important since Hera's work does not change the outside appearance of things. Rather, she insistently asks us to see two as one, with an inner vision. The more one studies the portrait of her in the Iliad, the more we see that Hera's outside and her inside hardly ever reliably reflect her interior intentions. So her outside and her inside are not the same. That's what I was trying to say. So indeed, Homer calls her Dolophroneusa, the goddess of the tricky mind. In his essay on Hera, Hillman offers a subjunctive proposition. It resonated with me, to use that wonderful formula from the Alchemy Inc. What Hillman says is this: we have to realize that Hera belongs to the basis of comedy. If one could take marriage both lightly and seriously, play the comedy and the depth, not only how do you live the practical and the ideal, and the sentence stops there. It seems to want to be continued, and I'm going to take the liberty of trying to continue this. So the paradoxical figure of Hera surely invites these questions, the questions of how opposites can dwell together. How can we bring what is light, which is to say what is gravity-defying, into union with what is deep, with gravity itself? When Hillman speaks of depth, my fellow panelists and others in this audience know far better than I what he means. But at a minimum, he is speaking of the unfathomable and murky depths of our souls. What Hillman means by comedy is surely influenced by his long friendship with my teacher, Louise Cowan, whom I quoted at the beginning of this essay. Dr. Cowan's theory, or who I'm quoting in my title, I should say, Dr. Cowan's theory of poetic genre helps us see, first, that comedy's action always has an upward arc, even if its beginnings seem to move us downward into the mire. There's always a way out in comedy, even from hell, if we read Dante. And Dr. Cowan also teaches us that comedy expresses the communal unconscious of a people, its yearning for a more liberated life. Comedy aims its gaze, she theorizes, upon a vision of final fulfillment. And fulfillment, teleia, is one of Hera's epithets, final fulfillment. In sum, Dr. Cowan holds that comedy is a visionary discipline, and its vision is an apocalyptic one. Aristophanes, for example, shows us that even the lowly dung beetle longs to feast on divine ambrosia, as Dr. Cowan loved to remind her students. Even more wonderfully, Aristophanes also shows us that the dung beetle can fly to Olympus and feast alongside Pegasus. So the genre of comedy itself invites us to imagine the marriage of what is light with what is deep, precisely as Hillman proposes in his essay. It is worth trying to imagine living in that paradoxical conjunction, for this is where Hera herself lives, I believe. So perhaps we can take ourselves, we can take on the thought experiment that Hillman invites, that is the work of imagining a marriage of levity and depth by acknowledging that Hera, perhaps we can begin by acknowledging that Hera governs other important dimensions of cosmic life in addition to marriage. At one of her cult sites in Stymphalos, Pausanias reports, Hera was worshipped in 3 different phases: as a child and virgin, Pais, as a fulfilled wife, Teleia, and as an alienated figure or as a widow, Hera. These 3 phases of feminine life are indications of the way time's passage shapes vision and experience. It is unsurprising, then, that Hera also governs the seasons. Let's see if I can make this. Yes, there she is, on her chariot with Zeus. The horai are the seasons, are the women walking next to the horses. So linguists tell us that the Greek word for season, hora, the stem for our English word, hour, is a cognate of Hera. So Hera indeed controls the very moment of our birth as the Heracles myth makes clear. In the myth remembered in the Iliad, Zeus announces that whoever is born at a certain hour will become a great king. Hera, all too aware that her husband intends to glorify a bastard child, delays the birth pangs of Zeus's mortal lover. And instead of Heracles becoming king at the appointed hour, a lesser man is born and becomes king. Heracles must endure the indignity of serving him. The extraordinary labors Heracles then undergoes are remembered in art and song. These labors make him a hero. Hera does not only govern time, as we can see from the Heracles myth as well. She also governs, she's the patron of, the heroic realm. So we hear the goddess's name once again in that word, hero. That linguistic echo is no accident, as etymological studies indicate. And the myths themselves are in this respect clear. Hera makes the hero. Heracles is, of course, the hero of the Greek tradition. His name obviously incorporates Hera's name, the name which is also the root of the word hero. It joins the goddess's name, Hera, with the Greek word for glory, kleos. And when we do the linguistic math, we realize that the name of Heracles signifies not only Hera's glory, Hera's kleos, as his name is almost always translated, but it also represents the glory of heroism itself, because to reflect and communicate Hera's glory is to be a hero. So consider this. After suffering his indignities and valiantly performing his labors, Heracles ultimately receives welcome from Hera on Olympus. And in that welcome, we begin to see that the hero is not defined by being a natural child of the gods, although, of course, Heracles is the natural child of Zeus. But he becomes a hero by becoming an adopted child of the gods. After testing him beyond all limits, after Heracles finally dies his horrifically painful death, he miraculously ascends to Olympus. And when he arrives there, Hera, we are told, mimics the travails of a woman in labor and then suckles the full-grown hero at her breast. Can you see this? I don't know if there's a pointer on this thing, but so that Hera is bending over, she's greeting the bearded Heracles who has just arrived on Olympus. And she is immortalizing him with her body. So this image comes to us from, it's an etched image on the back of a mirror. The etching is hard to make out. So this is a kind of translation of a mirror that's in the National Archaeological Museum in Florence. So if that is not comedy, what is? Heracles is the paradigmatic hero, the one who teaches us the glory of Hera. And he's not the only ancient hero associated with the goddess. It is Hera who sponsors Jason and the Argonauts as they make their quest for the Golden Fleece. It is Hera who gives Achilles the fateful idea to call an assembly in the first book of the Iliad. In that assembly, Achilles exposes Agamemnon's weakness as a leader. And in doing so, he lays the groundwork for the insult that will lead ultimately to Achilles' undying fame. And it is Hera by whom Socrates swears in the Apology as he prepares for his death. These luminous figures, Heracles, Jason, Achilles, Socrates, remind us that Hera exerts tremendous power over the deepest and most mysterious processes of individuation. She opens, at least for the select ones among us, the mystic possibility of rising above the mass of our fellow men and women in order to be recognized as great, in order to be remembered for generations, long after our mortal existence ends. It's worth noting, too, that heroism is yet another mode of exerting power over time, a way of transforming the indignity of death into something else. Again, what the Greeks call kleos, or glory. And even now, in our own benighted age, we can occasionally feel Hera's presence when the hero emerges among us. So, for example, I would like to propose that Hera manifests herself whenever that great hero of the North, the thrilling Green Bay Packers quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, throws one of his miraculous Hail Mary touchdown passes in the final seconds of a game that ordinary mortals would otherwise have considered lost. These Hail Mary passes remind us that even in its final excruciating minutes, seconds really, the game is not over. Life remains in it, yet in the mythic world that the quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, inhabits, the Mary he hails is a Christianized emblem of Hera, a figure who makes miraculous interventions, one who lifts our lives out of mundane probability and into a realm of grace. And since the Bard of Akron, Kwame Scruggs, is with us today, let us also note that LeBron James is another one of these Hera heroes. He can do this too, right? In the final seconds, you think it's over, but it's not. So what the figure of the hero teaches us, whether it is Aaron Rodgers or LeBron or Heracles, it is that Hera is with us whenever we surpass our natural limits. She changes our sense of time's passage. And so she changes our understanding of what is humanly possible. Even so, the price of heroism is death. And more precisely, perhaps, we should say with Achilles, the price of heroism is a short life, a life in which the last precious second matters most of all, a life in which that final minute matters, and through the hero's eyes, we can begin to see more clearly into Hera's power over time, her power to make that final minute elastic. So we know, of course, that through his kleos, or glory, the hero can live on figuratively in memory, even after his body returns to dust. But still, an irreducible irony remains. The more heroic you are, the more your sense of time's ruthless passage becomes acute. And the more heroic you are, the more intensely your loss will be felt by your community when you die, because the hero's death is not his alone. The Iliad's shining hero, Achilles, recognizes this irony of the heroic condition more powerfully than any other. His beauty and his heroic stature stem fully from his twin realizations that he must die and that he doesn't want to die, and that indeed no promise of glory can compensate him sufficiently for the fact of his mortality. So you may be wondering at this point, what does the bittersweet awareness of heroic mortality, what does the irreversibility of time have to do with marriage? And specifically, what do these other dimensions of Hera's divine being, her association with the seasons, her patronage of heroes, what do these have to do with what Hillman poignantly calls our marriage problem? So here's a brief attempt at an answer, which perhaps we can elaborate on conversation later. Hera awakens in us the sense that we are more than what our nature makes us. She is the goddess who lifts heroes out of mere goodness and makes them great. She enables them to defy the natural, withering predations of time. And for the rest of us, Hera is the goddess who lifts the human condition more generally out of the purely natural state. Marriage is the metaphor through which we see her best, perhaps, since it joins the animal sexual yearnings in us with something else, something higher and more mysterious than the animal condition. When we add up all the ways Hera moves through us as individuals, we begin to see her as a patron of our humanity, as opposed to animality. And when we add up all the ways she moves through our communities, we might recognize the transcendence she offers as culture as opposed to tribalism. So in Homer's poetics, the purest symbol of culture is marriage. Like marriage, culture is a work of imagination. It often feels unnatural. But still, our nature, our human nature, somehow demands it. We want culture. We want to be recognized by the other more than physically. So the figure of Hera reminds us that our own nature, like the goddess itself, like the goddess herself, our nature is paradoxical. This paradox is also the paradox of human culture, real culture, the culture that surprises us by resisting the tyranny of norms, measurable outcomes, civilization. This is why Hera is so hard to understand and why she is so easy for us to resent. She is the goddess who insistently awakens in us the natural demand that we rise beyond our own natures. This is difficult labor, not easily accomplished. And Hera's demands of us, therefore, are not always welcome. This is what makes her so